Finally, in this module on pay and productivity, I'd like to do a segment discussing why do large firms tend to pay more and discussing some of the controversy surrounding executive compensation. To begin with, large firms do statistically pay more for a particular job with a particular required skill set on average than do smaller firms. It's a phenomenon that we have to consider as to why this comes about. To begin with, we know that larger firms have larger scale effects. That means they have better economies of scale. Some of their other costs tend to be able to be lower per unit sold because of the size of the company, the sheer volume of the company. And given that they're able to charge the same price for the product as any other company in the market, it leaves more to either distribute to the profit share or possibly going to wages for employees. So one of the reasons they pay more is simply because they can. Another reason we have to consider is because larger firms seek to attract consistently high-quality workers and to keep them. They tend to put more money into training. They tend to put more money into recruitment. They tend to put more money into human resources. And because of this, they're looking for a high-quality employee that they'll keep for long periods of time. And to do that, they will then pay a wage seeking to keep that person. Think back to our conversation about efficiency wages, and also think about the concept of enforcement rents. They're paying a higher wage so that they can receive benefits, utility, values, productivity from the employees that smaller firms might not require or might not even expect. We also have to recognize that very often large firms are subject to union and union organizer demands, the demands of collective bargaining. We'll talk a little bit more about unions in an upcoming module within this course, but just recognize that unions, even though they have a diminished role in the U.S. labor market compared to that which they enjoyed in the 1960s, 70s, and maybe very early 80s, have a diminished role, they still are an important part of the U.S. labor market, and their influence is felt throughout the markets. Large firms are more likely to be targets of union organization than small firms, and so they pay more in part because of a reflection of that influence. And then finally, we know that large firms with their scales, their ability to obtain good quality employees, their ability to utilize, innovate, and maintain the highest technologies, the most recent production mechanisms, they simply end up having more productive workers within their environments. And because they have more productive workers, that additional productivity leads to an opportunity or ability to pay more for the worker than otherwise might have been expected. So now let's turn our attention to executive compensation. Executive compensation, or often referred to as CEO compensation, has been a hotbed issue within the labor markets now for well over a decade. It's a significant enough issue that it was the focus of the 1%, the Occupy Wall Street movement that we saw spring up in the mid-2000s, 2005, 6, 7, 8. That movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, or as I sometimes refer to it as the Occupy Every Place movement, at some point in time, we had occupiers, protesters, occupying virtually every meaningful park in the country, Central Park of every small town, every large town. In fact, we even occupied people's driveways. We occupied parking lots. We occupied places that no one ever would have thought to occupy. And while this was a relatively impotent movement, it wasn't focused, it didn't have any good organizing goals, it did accomplish one thing, and that is it accomplished the ability to raise the level of debate with respect to income inequality and a difference in compensation amongst the 1%ers versus the rest, the 99s, if you will. Well, we have to think about CEO compensation for a moment and have to try to parse out issues with respect to this debate or this somewhat cantankerous issue in the U.S. labor markets. Before we do that, let's think about how a CEO's pay comes about, how executive pays come about, and what they're intended to represent. First of all, chief executives or anyone in the executive suite, vice presidents on up, really are there to deal with what we think of as the principal agent problem. They are there, once again, to represent the owner's interests in the company and to see to it that the owner's or shareholders' interests are maintained. They also then need to deal with the needs of their employees, and so they have to constantly work to align the needs of the employees and the needs of the firm, or the needs of firm and the needs of employees, such that the shareholders' interests are protected, because these executives at virtually every level, certainly in the CEO suite, their responsibility is not to treat their employees well. Their responsibility is not to maintain a socially harmonic relationship and microcosm of society. Their responsibility is to protect shareholder interests and to produce profits. If they don't do this, they can either be ousted by their shareholders or boards of directors, or they can even be sued for being in violation of the contracts that they probably signed. We have to recognize that the vast majority of executives exist on contract. They have signed an employment agreement, keeps them from being able to compete with the company if they choose to leave, gives them some bonuses, gives them some salary, gives them some performance targets often to meet. And when they meet those targets, regardless of how or why, when they meet those targets, then the company is obligated, contractually obligated, to pay them the income that the contract states will give them. Now, this income typically is a combination of some relatively attractive cash award salary, some benefits, health insurance, company perks, perhaps access to the company plane or company properties, seats at the Delta Center, etc., if those are things that this company happens to maintain. Certainly retirement plans, stock options, etc. So it gives them both of those. In fact, in most cases, CEOs or senior executives of the company receive upwards of half of their annual income in terms of these non-cash or non-salary oriented benefits, which includes very often meaningful cash bonuses at some point during the year, meaningful stock awards, and meaningful stock options. And again, most of these are by contract. It's always been interesting to me how the population, or the populace, if you will be up in arms about a CEO that made a tremendous amount of money in a year in which the company perhaps posted a loss, or perhaps just didn't do well in the markets, or had some other controversy. That CEO probably was simply earning what the contract said that they should earn. You have to know that the board of directors, representing the shareholders, when there's been a loss posted for the company, doesn't want to pay that CEO as much as they're being paid more than any of the rest of us do. They're very interested in keeping costs down, but if they have a contract that says they have to pay the CEO a certain dollar amount based upon having met certain performance requirements or benchmarks, then they pay that. Now, the CEO certainly is able to say no thank you and give it back to the company or turn it down, but CEOs, just like anyone else, are REM. They're rational, evaluating, manipulative maximizers. They're going to seek their best interests, like the rest of us will, and it's rare that they will turn down a significant cash award or stock options or stock bonuses, even if they might be able to do so. It's interesting to me also that CEOs really need to consider the long-term and the short-term needs of the company. And if there's fault that lies anywhere with the CEO contracts and the high executive compensation, that fault probably lies with the board of directors, who represent the shareholders in these employment relationships and transactions, because it's that board of directors that ratifies executive compensation plans. The board of directors should always be seeking for the long-term best interest of the company. They should be seeking to create contracts that offer good long-term incentives, but far too often they become subject to pressure and bow to the pressure to reward for short-term incentives, short-term stock gain, short-term earnings, rather than looking out for the long-term interests of the company, the shareholders, its employees, and possibly even the customers. When we think about CEO pay, we have to think about what the real ratios are. I was reading an article that was written on April 15th of last year, 2014, from Forbes magazine. And it quotes that CEOs earn 331 times as much as their average workers. Let me say it again. CEOs earn 331 times the amount of the average worker in their company. Well, that's a pretty indicting headline, if you will. But let's stop and parse it out for just a moment. Think about CEOs, which are simply the chief executive officers of corporations throughout the country. Big companies, small companies, profitable companies, those barely breaking even, those operating at a loss. Well, in this case, if you go through all the detail of this article and actually look at some of the source material that it was representing, we find that it's actually the Fortune 500, or excuse me, S&P 500, Standard & Poor's 500 listed chief executive officers that earned 331 times as much as their average worker. In fact, those same chief executives earned 774 times the minimum wage, which seems rather egregious to us. And we lump CEOs then into this category that makes them seem somewhat egregious. But in fact, this was only the top 500 CEOs in the country. For some years, I acted as a CEO of different corporations that I held. And some of those were profitable corporations. Sometimes those were corporations that were barely breaking even. And in a couple of cases, and in a couple of years, some of those corporations actually posted losses. But as a CEO of that company, or those companies, I certainly didn't earn significant multiples of what most of my employees earned, although I did earn some premium well above what my employees earned. Those were my companies. It was my capital that was at stake. I worked longer hours. I took greater risk. I worked with greater intensity. Now, that may or may not be able to be said of all the CEOs between my level of firm and up to the Standard & Poor's 500 level of CEOs. Clearly, CEOs in that category underneath the Fortune 500 make some multiple of what many of their employees make, but it's only the most highly compensated, largest company CEOs that make hundreds of times of what their average workers make. So it's probably incumbent on us to put this in perspective and recognize that, yes, there is a multiple taking place here, but that multiple for most CEOs probably is simply reflective of the risk that they're taking and the capital they have invested. We also have the reality that many CEOs or many presidents of corporations or many business owners often take no salary at all. The average small business person, which happens to be the CEO of their company, unless they're operating at a profit, they have no income to take. And when they do operate at a profit, sometimes they then have to make up for months or years where they didn't take income, or perhaps they simply are taking that money, whatever the amount is, and then sometimes they end up reinvesting it in the company when the company is cash-strapped. So we have to keep these things in perspective. One of the things I'm always interested in is to see how people view corporations and their executives and their shareholders. Excuse me. I think it was Governor Mitt Romney, when he was running for president several years ago, that made the comment that corporations were people. I think what Governor Romney meant to say was that corporations are owned by people, and the shareholders are people. And if you own the company, then you may as well be the company, because in the eyes of the law, you pretty much are. And in that context, corporations are people. It was taken differently than that, and I think perhaps it was a bad choice of words for the governor. Certainly didn't serve him well in his election bid. But at any rate, we ended up in a situation where we had to think about how corporations act and in whose best interest they act and what the purpose for their acting is. As we think about chief executives, anyone in the executive suite, anyone with a supervisory responsibility, we have to stop and remember that their role is to align the interests of the firm or its owners and the interests of the workers. They have a balancing act of sorts. And sometimes that's extraordinarily difficult. And one of the most difficult things about that is it's hard to identify a marginal revenue product of labor for these CEOs. We have a class of CEO in our country that we think of as being a celebrity CEO. These are the Jack Welches of the world. Jack Welch is the former CEO and chairman of General Electric. And Welch is famously outspoken. He's written several books and talks about celebrity CEOs in a couple of his different writings, includes himself in this category of celebrity CEO. And these are CEOs who don't necessarily get involved in the day-to-day operations of the company, which most large corporation CEOs don't. They have senior vice presidents or executives that report to them, who have vice presidents who report to them, who have supervisors and managers that report to them, and so on and so on. So they leave the details of the company to other people who report up through them, although they do tend to end up being responsible for these. They certainly are held accountable to them or for them by the board of directors and the shareholders. But these CEOs, because of their celebrity status, are able to bring in business, are able to work out financial relationships, are able to lobby for influence in the halls of Congress, are able to make rain, if you will, that many others would not. And they tend to charge a premium for this. Now, we have to consider as labor economists whether or not those premiums are warranted. And our only mechanism is that we have to think about marginal revenue product of labor, or MRP and its relationship with the wage. And the wage for the CEO is going to be a composite of the cash bonus, stock options, benefits, salaries, etc., perks, everything. Well, it's difficult to measure that marginal revenue product of labor. And because of that, we sometimes default to just considering, well, what was this change in shareholder value during that CEO's time in office? If the CEO's time brought about a 10% increase in shareholder value, stock market went up by 10%, does that mean that the productivity of the company increased because of the CEO's influence? And if it did, was that the only reason the stock value went up by the 10%? And how much might that 10% represent? Well, let's face it, even 1% in many, many of these large companies will represent billions of dollars. And so what percentage of that increase should be attributed to the chief executives? The CEO landscape in this country is highly sought after, extraordinarily competitive, and it tends to include some of the most innovative and most strategic thinkers we have in this country. And to keep them at the top of our corporations, at the top of our most productive business entities, it now requires a tremendous income. Whether it should require that or not is another issue. Whether it's economically efficient, socially beneficial or not is yet another issue. But to keep that benefit flowing for our domestic economy and its contributions to GDP, it may be that is necessary. Absent some regulatory changes that might be put in place to moderate this. I was listening to a dissertation defense recently by a gentleman here at the University of Utah by the name of Alex Kangas. Dr. Kangas successfully defended his dissertation and indicated that absent regulations in our environment, then corporations and the moneyed interests, if you will, in our society tend not to work toward their own collective self-interests, which is interesting. And he pointed out numerous examples of this. He pointed out rigorous numeric analyses of this and indicated in his conclusion that it's only in the face of regulations that this group is able to act in its collective self-interest. Well, since 1980, we've had an increasingly deregulating economy, and it's only been since 1980 that we've seen this average CEO pay, average executive pay, rise to such extraordinary heights above the wage of the average worker. It's a difficult landscape, but at the end of the day, the chairman, CEO, the executives of a corporation are responsible to their shareholders to make money, and if they've done a good enough job of that, then they're deserving of whatever the contract that they have signed and entered into is providing for them.